In my video last week, I talked about how 8 of 10 of the most popular shows on my anime list are battle shonen. If you want to talk about anime as a whole, you at some point have to have a conversation about the influence action has had on the medium, which leads to some interesting questions, like what makes action such a prominent part of anime? What about animation's process lends itself to action as a form of conflict? Why do I find Western action films boring, yet still consume and enjoy so much action in anime? These are all points I want to explore when focusing on the main question of this video. What if there was a story that didn't prioritize action at all, then still did it in brief moments at a world-class standard? Oh yeah, and there's 2 of them. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about outstanding action sequences in shows where you least expect it. If you're familiar with this channel, you're no stranger to the fact that I talk a lot about Frieren and Dungeon Meshi. A lot of people rightfully assume it's because I love these shows, but in reality, I think it has more to do with the fact that I just love talking about them. They feel jam-packed with interesting little things to explore. One of those ideas I've been sitting on for a long time is the way Frieren uses action sequences. They use fights so sparingly, especially in the first half of the season, while being so effective. The scenes are brief, yet still some of my favorite action sequences I've seen. This video really came together is in noticing Dungeon Meshi doing the same thing, incorporating fantastic, expressive animation and world-class execution that comes out of nowhere. Now there are a couple scenes from these shows I want to explore that are perfect examples. But before we do that, I want to better understand action's impact on anime as a medium because I think it adds a lot of context and magnitude. So why are so many fantastic anime filled with action? I've had this plan since I was a kid to eventually write a book. I'd like it to be fun first and meaningful second. I think those stories are the easiest to consume. There are tons of amazing shows that I haven't finished because I just lost interest, which is especially crazy because there's some terrible shows I have finished purely because they were engaging. The audience's attention is a constant wheel of friction that's looking to stop. Stories that are fun first tend to be the more popular ones, especially when they end up going somewhere emotionally. I think a major reason why battle shonen has such a hold over anime is because it's just fun. Take for example the author of One Piece, where Eiichiro Oda has been quoted multiple times talking about how his target audience is young boys, and he can't get too caught up in telling a narrative complex story over one that's fun. Ultimately, his audience wants to see 2 strong people fighting. Now, I do also believe that doesn't get in the way of him delivering on the emotional aspects, but a lot of stories prioritize action. Frieren and Dungeon Meshi do not. They are not action-first stories. They are absolutely driven by their characters and setting. Normally, stories with great action are prioritizing it. While action is fun and serves the story as a lowest common denominator to escalating emotional tension, it's also incredibly intensive in animation, which leads to our second point. Animation as a medium properly lends itself to take full advantage of action. The thing that differentiates animation from a painting or other visual arts is movement. And in that process of animating a show, there's tons of room for artistic expression, exaggeration, and lies that tell the truth. Do you know what correlates beautifully with all 3 of those things? Fight choreography. Anime is filled with fantastic magic systems, exaggerated ability. It's also satisfying. But animation is also one of the most time-consuming, expensive mediums to work in. Anime as an industry functions on razor-thin margins. But those limitations, despite being incredibly prevalent, hasn't stopped this golden age of anime fight scenes. I mean, I almost feel like we're even on the other side of that. Fight scenes have gotten so detailed and so impressive, they're getting in the way of their own blocking and choreography. Independent of that, animation standards are through the roof. And I think in some ways there's this clean, beautiful execution that comes with both Frieren and Dungeon Meshi's fight scenes that stand out to me just as much as any other battle show. So a quick synopsis of what I was essentially trying to argue there is that the benefits that fight scenes bring to storytelling, anime seems to multiply on. There's so much room for expression, art style, and exaggeration, so when someone punches another person through a wall, it doesn't feel so corny. And you can get so much from a fight scene in mixing realism and exaggeration. I think this ties into my third question, which is why do I love action anime when I struggle so much with Western action films? I think part of it is the writing for these stories. I think that shonen is so much more engaging emotionally for me, but I also think it's mostly what I was just talking about, that action is so expressive and so satisfying to consume. Like, think about some of the best fights you've ever seen. Even looking at a show like Naruto, Kakashi vs. Obito, Rock Lee vs. Gaara, Naruto vs. Sasuke 1, 2, and 3, because my expectations were set so high from an early age as someone who grew up watching Naruto, when I watch something like Mission Impossible, it feels like a pseudo-superhero movie, where there's actually very little narrative tension in every fight. It's characters overcoming ridiculous odds time and time again. Now don't get me wrong, there are live action films that are remarkably well made. They just feel like the minority. So part of what makes Dungeon Meshi and Frierin's action sequences so standout is that they're both incredibly immersive, but they could be cut from the story or replaced with very bad action sequences and still be outstanding shows. Now, an important asterisk on that is that these fight scenes do so much for the story. Just standalone outside of them, they're good stories anyways. But the thing that appeals to me the most in the way that Frieren and Dungeon Meshi do fights is they tap into this feeling that's kind of hard to explain. It's almost realistic. Something I've learned in being a YouTuber and making music professionally, working behind the scenes with some very famous people, is that all of it's less glamorous than you'd think. There's this quote up there that I can't remember where it came from that argues art is monotony most of the time. Touring musicians may perform in front of thousands of people, but that's also matched with months of rehearsal, huge portions of the year with major downtime, and long days on a tour bus without showers driving across nothingness. There's very few things where that's more true than actual combat. In reality, war is brutal and random and monotonous. There's this myth of the skilled soldier in storytelling, that one person can be so skilled they can withstand the chaos of war. The reason that exists is because it's more fun. When you look at something like a UFC fight, there's all these rules and breaks to prolong it, because otherwise it'd be over too fast. But that's kind of what Dungeon Meshi and Frieren do perfectly. They capture that monotony. So let's look at a couple of their scenes. Let's start first with Dungeon Meshi. It took me a while before I was fully sold on this show. There were a couple major tipping points, all of which happened to be fights, which is interesting because when I think of Dungeon Meshi, the action is not what comes to mind first. In episode 8, there's this one fight that I really like. Marcel, a mage and one of the primary characters of the story, pours boiling water into the wrong lake. It turns out it's the residence of a powerful water-based magical creature named an Undine. This scene is really well paced and takes full advantage of the threat this monster poses. Marcel finds herself without her staff. Without a catalyst to focus her magic, she loses accuracy and capability. It's almost like another character finding themselves in the middle of a fight without their sword. Now this scene starts with Marcel dodging this creature's attacks. This piercing high-pressure water that almost feels like a bullet firing from a gun. This is a really cool way of writing a magical creature because it's very intuitive, because we have real-world examples of high-pressured water being dangerous, like water jets, machines capable of cutting through metal. Now in dodging these attacks, she falls into the water and casts a water walking spell on herself. This creates really clear limitations. She doesn't have her staff, and her allies can't join them. They can't walk on the water themselves unless a spell is cast on them, and swimming against a monster like this would be a death sentence. So they have to contribute from an outside perspective looking in. Someone actually highlighted this in a comment in one of my videos recently, and I strongly agree. Sometimes when people talk about good fight scenes, they just focus on the animation and choreography. But the setup and how it builds tension, whether or not it ties into the story and characters, these are all equally important. And this situation is really well crafted. The fight turns dire. She's shot through the leg and shoulder, struggling to keep track of where the Undine is in the water. The shots are just gorgeous, her stuck out on the water by herself, fighting a creature made from the very thing she's standing on. All this matched with beautiful animation that I never expected from a show like this. Part of what makes these fight scenes in Dungeon Meshi and Frieren feel so different to me is the way they capture this very specific type of realism. If you've ever found yourself in a really high stress situation, they tend to be very chaotic and over quickly. The story's built around action, showing the monotony that would come with being a dungeon crawler or adventurer would get in the way of, I think, the fun of the story. But that's why when a show's not built around action but still does it at a really high standard, it gets to do that feels unique and consistent with the goal of the story. Like one of the most applicable skills I think would be really relevant for characters in both Dungeon Meshi and Frieren is the ability to handle stress well. Because if characters had familiarity with intense situations to the point of being able to respond effectively, that would be like so valuable. Which is really cool because it's kind of a major point in the story. There's this whole other character that's introduced who's so skilled but lacks practical experience. Juxtapose that to Laios, who fights in an incredibly unmajestic, practical way. I mean, major conflict in this setting would actually more often look like problem solving than it would a direct fair fight. The fact that it's so messy and unglamorous while still being animated beautifully, I just think it's the coolest thing. The second fight I want to talk about is from episode 6 of Frieren, where our primary character Stark, who's a warrior, fights a dragon. I'm not alone here when I point at this specific fight as a major wow moment in the series. Like a scene where you stop and really consider just how good it is. One that immediately in the moment showcases its significance. Frieren doesn't have a lot of action sequences, especially in the first half of the series, but you could point at almost every single one of them before the mage exam as being standout examples of remarkable action. However, this scene was really special because it kind of redefined my expectations of what the show was capable of offering. I mean, episode 3 kind of has something too, but I don't think it was at this level. And I've seen a lot of people sharing the same sentiment online. It stands out. Stark is a warrior estranged from his master, a dwarf named Eisen, one of Frieren's party members from 40 years ago when they saved the world, the setup to this story. Eisen and Stark had a pretty intense falling out, and stopped speaking to one another on pretty bad terms. Venturing out on his own, Stark eventually found himself in a city being attacked by a dragon, and despite being overwhelmed by fear, he stood between those people and the monster, and was lauded as a hero. But when the dragon retreated, Stark couldn't understand why, and he felt stuck in the city, unable to face his fear of taking on the dragon, but afraid that if he were to leave, the dragon might attack. Stuck between a rock and a hard place, Frieren shows up and offers him a solution. If he can briefly keep the dragon occupied, she'll be able to finish it off with a powerful spell. Stark is a character that's introduced as that classic coward archetype. It's actually the topic of my most popular video. But the shorthand is that he's terrified for good reason. He lacks practical experience, he's done nothing but train, he has no point of reference. But with Frieren offering help, Stark faces his fear. Fighting the constant urge to run away, with shaking hands, Stark approaches the dragon. And you get all these beautiful little details, like this little sequence where he slides beneath the dragon's tail and drags his axe behind him to influence his momentum. Or when they're setting up the fight and they contextualize just how small he is compared to this monster. Frieren's doing this great little monologue talking about the similarities between Eisen and Stark, both of which were afraid before battle. The directing, sound design, music, it all works so well in conjunction, and you get these fantastically animated scenes. And after 30 seconds past the agreed upon time, he anxiously screams at Frieren to take the shot that she's been setting up, only to realize in retrospect that he, in this fight against the dragon on his own, killed it. Where Dungeon Meshi consistently impressed me with its beautiful animation, this sequence is one of the best I've ever seen. I've talked about it in multiple videos before. There are just so many little moments and details that add so much. And it's not just the animation. The music, sound design, directing, and pacing are just some of many pieces that work cohesively to make something special. But it also kind of is just the animation. For Dungeon Meshi and Frieren to come along and tell stories as well as they did, that's one thing, but to just dip into world-class action in a way that fits so perfectly with the story and characters, it's especially impressive. Huge impacts in just brief moments. Thank you for watching. I'll see y'all next week.